Hello. Today I would like to be showing you my Game Boy macro, which I have recently made and I think looks really nice, and I'd like to tell y'all about it today. So essentially a Game Boy macro is essentially a DS Lite, but you take the top screen off, and because the bottom of it reads like Game Boy Advance games, it'll play them just perfectly, which is just great because as you may know, these are a lot cheaper to make, like since DS lights are so much cheaper and they already have a nice IPS screen that if you put this glass screen lens on makes it look even better. Essentially they're really cheap to make, which is a lot cheaper than using like an old GBA like this one, because these ones cost a lot more money for like not as good as stuff. Like just to get an IPS screen for this would be almost the same cost, or sorry, it would be more cost than just making a regular DS Lite mod or a GBA macro mod, because I used a boxy pixel shell, which bumps up the cost a lot, but you don't have to. You could use like the original shell, like right like this, put like a light pipe through it or whatever, but I chose not to do that because I just personally liked how the boxy pixel shells look, and I thought it looked a lot nicer. One problem I do have with the boxy pixel shell is it doesn't get rid of how like this looks, which I'm not a big fan of, which how the cartridge sticks out. I think it just looks better without that. But there's a really easy solution, which is like you can buy like $40 flash cards that you can just dump ROMs onto, which does make it so you have a bunch of ROMs on there at all time. And that also fixes my other problem with it, that DS macros, one of their biggest problems is they can't play original Game Boy and Game Boy Color games because, honestly, I personally don't know exactly why, but I think it's something to do with, like, they didn't, in the Game Boy Advance, like this one, they hooked up a Game Boy, like, CPU to it, so it has perfect emulation compatibility, or not emulation, but perfect compatibility with it. See how it loads up like that? It wouldn't do that in this one. In this one, they actually put like plastic tabs on the case so that you couldn't insert it. I see it won't go all the way in because, and you guys probably can't see it, but there are two like plastic tabs down there that'll stop it from going in. And even if you do like trim those tabs down or trim the shell down to get it in, it won't work. But there are flash cards you'll get that'll like fit flush in here. Like when the DS came out, it had a card or dust thingy that would block it. It'd essentially be the same size to that, so it wouldn't stick out, which I think would look really nice. And then there's one other problem I have with this boxy pixel shell is that you have to use hot glue for this thing, because you see how it's like really bright there and like really uneven around it. That's because usually products like this, or like official ones, would have a little plastic bit there, like clear one, that essentially diffuse the light. They're like light diffusers, so they diffuse it much more evenly and like much less bright. Like, see the comparison between those? My biggest problem with this is you're supposed to use hot glue to fill that in, which for something as expensive as this, I'm just not comfortable with. So there's these things you can buy online where essentially you can just put them in here and they'll just little plastic tabs that'll work just as good, which I think is really nice. And I am getting some of those shipped here, so I can't wait for that. But I want to show off this. Another thing I like about this one is it uses the old back shell, which is really nice to reuse it, which also means you have like which also means you can also reuse the old battery in this, which is really nice because then you don't have to buy a new battery, because some of the boxy pixel shells, they use their own back, which means you'd have to buy their own battery, but in this case you thankfully don't, which also keeps it still very thin, you know, very thin compared to Mr. Chunky Boy over here, who I can barely fit in frame. I can really fit in frame the other one too. But yes, that's very nice. And I also, started soldering some of my mods for the first time because I got a soldering iron. So now the improvement of stuff's happening. Like usually you'd have to put a small chip in this, but I found out you don't have to, so I didn't solder that in, because usually there's this really annoying chip you have to solder in, or a resistor, or whatever it's called, that essentially make it so the DS Lite can turn on without a game inside of it. But I found out if you just have that game in, it'll turn on just fine. Or, alright, so it has a game in it, but if you don't have a game in, it'll do this. But it'll still work. Yeah, it'll still work when you put a game in just fine, so. But one of the other mods is, and the Boxy Pixel shell includes holes for this, essentially is I soldered a speaker into it. Hopefully you can hear that, but essentially there's a speaker you can put into it so you can actually hear it, because if you didn't know, on the original DS Lite, the top screen right here, which used to be like right here, it has the speakers in it. So now that I like ripped them, now that I took this off, it doesn't have speakers, so I had to solder one on, but it does sound pretty nice. It's just a Nintendo Switch speaker that I used, you know, just like one of these. So they're really easy and cheap to find, which is really convenient, and you can just get them, and you know, like you can just find them on Amazon for like $5 each, which is really nice and really cheap, which is my favorite part about that, because, you know, why not? I love cheap stuff. But as you can hear, that's like max volume-ish. It's not loud, but it's also not like it's not really quiet. Because like when I was finding stuff about this online, about the speaker, everyone was like, it's super quiet, you need to get Helder's Flex Amp mod or whatever. So essentially what that is, it's something that would go right around here, and you'd solder the speaker to it, and it'd also have that tiny resistor I was talking about earlier that would let the DS turn on without you having to have a game on it. But you don't need that, essentially. Like, you never did, but like a lot of people say it's really good because of it, and I'm sure it is. And what the guy who makes them, I'm sure he makes amazing stuff. It's just me personally, I don't think with like the max volume of this, I don't think I'd need like that. I don't think I'd need anything louder. I think this is a very good like sound loudness, or whatever you'd call it. I think it's loud enough for me personally. I wouldn't need it to be any louder. So I think that's perfect for me. But I'm also going to be, like I said earlier, I'm just repeating myself now, the things I'm going to fix about this is I'm going to get a cartridge that would fit in better, and then light pipe for that, which can't wait for those to come in. But once I do, then I'll have like the perfect GBA for me, and it'll just work amazingly. So if you have an old DS Lite that's preferably broken or something, like broken hinge or broken top screen, I think this mod would be perfect to do. And even if you don't, this mod is still very good to do. And even if you don't have an old DS Lite, they're super cheap, so you can find one like really easily for like $20 to $30 with a broken hinge or a broken top screen. And you could just do this. Like, you don't need this Boxy Pixel shell, which I have, because the Boxy Pixel shells are kind of expensive. Like I said earlier, you could just use one of these shells and it just look like that, basically. But it's much better than one of these. Alright, so thank you for watching. That was my, little showcase of my GBA macro. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.